Sometimes a parent will have a favorite child. It may be in subtle ways, like one sibling's allowance being just a few dollars higher, or they might get slightly better Christmas presents. Not obvious enough that they're picking favorites, but there is one they like more. Other times, one child gets a brand new car, all expensive paid, and the other child gets $100 towards one that hasn't seen the light of day since Richard Nixon was president. And then we have the Exodites. The Eldar are already the unwanted siblings in GW's big old family of tabletop armies. They got kids old enough to drink and get cheaper car insurance, no love in the lore, and half their characters have yet to return to the store. The Exodites are the unwanted child compared to the Eldar. There is no Exodite army. It doesn't exist. You can't play it. But what little bits and pieces they get are just so enticing that you gotta wonder, why? Why do you hate the Eldar this much, Games Workshop? Why do you look at elves riding dinosaurs and declare that they don't get an army of their own? Were you hurt by elves, GW? Did an elf riding a dinosaur steal the mail from your porch? Well, I think they're cool, so they're what we're talking about today. Have you ever wanted to see fey beings appear out of the woods to burn down everything you know and love with the aid of forest creatures before vanishing as if into thin air? Well, if you're only interested in 40k, then I'm afraid you're gonna keep being disappointed, because the wood elves aren't here, but at the very least I can tell you about the best army GW still hasn't made after all this time. But you know, the Exodites are quite smart, wouldn't you say? I mean, they saw what was coming for the rest of the Eldar and got right out of Dodge. And if you too would like to be as smart as the Exodites, you can do no better than Brilliant, the sponsor of today's video. Brilliant is the premier website to learn math, data, computer science skills, and more. With thousands of lessons at your fingertips, you can learn the best material at the click of a button. It gives you hands-on problem skills that are 6 times as effective as normal teaching, and because Brilliant has made me so smart, I know that 6 times something is a whole lot. But it also helps you develop critical thinking skills. Critical thinking skills, as it turns out, are what you're going to be using for the majority of your life, not rote memorization like what tests usually force you into. And of course, all of this is at your leisure. You got 3 hours a day to focus on Brilliant? Fantastic, you're going to be smarter than ever before. Only 10 minutes every other day? Well, that's just fine too. No matter how often or how little you use it, Brilliant is here to make sure you learn what you set your mind to. A good course to try might be creative coding. As it turns out, you can do a lot of wonderful things with some coding knowledge. Be it a job at a high-tech firm or creating the next game of the year, coding can help you with both, so this course might start you on a journey you never knew you had in you. And just to seal the deal, I have a deal for you. Using my link in the description, you can get not only 20% off your annual plan, but a free 30-day trial. That's https://brilliant.org/pancreasnowork/ for 20% off your annual plan and 30 days free. Knowledge is power, or so the Thousand Sons keep banging on about, and their whole shtick is being smart. So get Brilliant today and make sure you never stop learning. Now then, let's pretend anyone interested in this army is ever gonna have fun. I'll just be honest with you, almost every image I have here is gonna be wood elves, either from fantasy or D&D or whatever I can convince myself looks wood elfy enough. The Eldar Exodites were the second group of Eldar who saw what was going on during the build-up to the fall of the Eldar and got the hell out of Dodge, the other of course being the Craftworlders. It's spelled out pretty firmly in their name, Exodites. They went on an exodus from the rest of the Empire. We are firmly in the land of GW naming here, and unfortunately the writing doesn't get much better because we're almost out of writing to look at already. And no, I'm not going to stop making no-writing jokes because they make the Leagues of Votann lore look as extensive as Ultramarines lore. For the sake of both honesty and giving them an actual amount of video length, some of the lore I'm about to tell you could very likely be easily attributed to the Craftworlders as well. But the Craftworld video was the second one I ever made and it wasn't perfect, and that fills me with all sorts of dread saying that out loud, so here's some semi-bonus lore on top. I'll even say it without sounding like I'm about to suck-start a shotgun, which was a real problem in my early videos, I've noticed. When the Eldar were beginning their slide into degeneracy, the ones that would become the Exodites were some of the first to decry what the rest of them were doing as being absolutely horrible. Most of those Eldar were too busy getting jiggy with it to bother with the Exodites in any fashion, just saying whatever the space elf equivalent of OK Boomer is, and then going back to the Murder Orgy Coliseum. Some of the Exodites were doubtlessly subject to whatever horrible hobbies some of the more creative Eldar were getting up to, but for the most part, the Eldar creating Slaanesh seemed to just ignore them. That doesn't mean the fun completely passed them by. Remember how every Eldar either is or has the potential to be a powerful psyker? Turns out, some of the Exodites would look into the future to foresee what was coming so they could warn everyone. This was oftentimes a horrible decision for their sanity. Orican the Diviner was so afraid of the birth of Slaanesh that the shockwaves of it made him hide away for centuries, and he's a Necron who has no soul. It's supposed to be impossible for that kind of stuff to affect him, and it gave him PTSD. To some random Eldar looking into the future and seeing the gaping hole the majority of their species was spiraling towards, this was the sort of thing that caused an instant Darkest Dungeon style mental break. Eventually, as with the Craftworlders, the Exodites couldn't stay any longer. Whether out of disgust towards their brethren or because the writing on the wall was growing ever more ominous, the Exodites would become the first to flee from the Eldar Empire's worlds. They turned towards the most remote worlds in the galaxy far from the epicenter of the Empire, what's known as a maiden world. I'll touch upon them soon. As for them surviving the birth, it was a much more binary affair than the Craftworld experience was. Planets are stationary things, at least in the time span we're working with. While some craftworlds like Altway were close enough to get caught in the Eye of Terror's pull but not sucked in, or others like Altansar were slowly but surely dragged in, the Exodites only had two outcomes. Either the planet they chose to settle on was far away enough and they survived Slaanesh's birth, hooray, or it wasn't and they all instantly died, boo-hoo. The maiden worlds they ended up on were worlds that were once barren planets terraformed by the Eldar Empire. This wasn't no Stellaris terraforming where you spend 10 grand and then 10 years later you have a Gaia world. These were seeded millions of years ago with magical bacteria and all sorts of other elf crap until eventually they became paradise worlds. Somewhat unfortunately for the Eldar who would become the Exodites, they didn't really interact with them until the Exodus began. There were no buildings, markers, or even just a sign saying property of the Eldar, no squatters allowed. As a result, many of these worlds would come to be settled by other species, most frequently humanity and the orcs. Dealing with the orcs went exactly how you'd think it did, but humanity at least was offered mercy by the Eldar. It was a harsh mercy to be sure, though. It was basically, leave this planet or we'll kill all of you. And I have to admit that oftentimes this was quite the dick move on the Eldar's part. Sure, I'm not going to feel bad for the most advanced human colonies or Mechanicus outposts being told to leave. You can set up a Forge world anywhere, it doesn't need to be on a Maiden world. But the offer was the same even for humans that had devolved into the Stone Age during the Age of Strife. So some Fey beings far beyond the understanding of these people would show up, tell them to leave, and then when they relocated their tribe to a different cave, the Eldar would go not good enough and kill them anyways. Like I said, bit of a dick move. Their society forms an interesting contrast to the Craftworlders because the Exodites have both more freedom in all they do while also simultaneously being far more restricted. It's intentionally so, but it's still restrictive nonetheless. The Exodites, even more so than the Craftworlders, felt that their entire society had gone too far into excess, and things needed to be done to deal with it. The Craftworlders solved this with the path system, and focusing their attentions and passions on one single craft for hundreds of years. The Exodites, meanwhile, became the Amish. No fancy spaceships and aspect armor for them. Once they arrived on the Maiden Worlds, they rid themselves of almost all the Eldar had gained. The vast majority of 65 million years of technological and psychic development done away with in the blink of an eye. Instead, the Exodites live almost purely off the land of the Maiden Worlds. They rarely, if ever, have large populations, preferring instead to live in small communities that are frequently nomadic in nature as they follow around animal herds. In particular, they hunt animals that are known as dragons, although in practice, they're dinosaurs. Pterodactyls, T-Rexes, Triceratops. If it comes from Jurassic Park, the Exodites hunt and tame it. In order to make up for almost entirely lacking wraithbone, the Exodites fashioned structures, weapons, armor, and more from the bones of the animals they hunt. It isn't quite as good as wraithbone, but don't take that to mean it's weak or useless. The Exodites are some of the most efficient hunters out there. Every scrap of meat, every bone, every hide will be turned into clothing, a weapon, a tent, what have you. And these animals are still the results of planetary terraforming by magical space elves. Of course they can use them to make some crazy shit. Minor spoilers for the Infinite Divine coming up now and a little bit later, although it's only from the first chapter, so it doesn't really matter that much. The planet much of the plot focuses around was originally an Exodite world, and the Eldar forces mustered were enough to put Trazyn on the back foot for his initial incursion. He of course won, because he's someone attacking the Exodites and therefore will win guaranteed, but a dinosaur ate him and most of his forces were destroyed for his troubles. It's a loss still, but it's at least a loss where they were giving one of the most prominent Necron characters and his elite forces trouble. They also do still have some wraithbone, so they aren't completely lacking in the stuff. This lifestyle naturally leaves them with less options for things to do than their Craftworld cousins. As much as it is designed to focus all their attention on one thing, there's nothing in place stopping an Eldar from changing their path. If you change it every 2 days, people are probably going to look at you funny at best and investigate you for Slaanesh corruption at worst, but there's no mandatory waiting time or checklist you need to fill before switching. Exodites, meanwhile, are stuck there. They're stuck on their planet, stuck living as hunter-gatherers, all because to them, even the regimented lifestyle of the Craftworlders has too much potential for downfall. Or at the very least, they view it as more dangerous. That being said, during day-to-day life, it can be easily argued they're far freer than their spaceborne cousins. There's no path system for the Exodites, so with what they have, they can do pretty much whatever they want in their free time. Get smashed on wine, go hunt a woolly mammoth, and then write a poem about it. Who cares? The planet will provide for you as long as you put in the effort. And there's no pull on your soul in everyday life that you need to worry about. Speaking of, maiden worlds aren't terribly hard to live on. In theory, they're savage and wild planets, but at the same time, you gotta remember this is coming from the Eldar point of view. Prior to settling on a maiden world, they had to do literally nothing for their needs to be met. They would think, "I sure am hungry," and then psychic drones would ferry them an infinite supply of Big Macs, assuming they couldn't just wish them into existence with magic. By our standards, a maiden world is the Garden of Eden, where all you need to do is reach out and grab fruit from the trees that'll sustain you for the entire day. But compared to what they had before, any amount of effort is infinitely more puritanical than the Eldar Empire. They live in semi-tribal societies and get into all sorts of honor duels between differing groups, but at least to me, it really seems more like those exist to give them something to do. They'll very intentionally avoid burning another group's stored food or crops down, and generally any conflict that arises between Exodite groups is very minimally destructive. They're all just there to hide from Slaanesh. Any conflict they get up to is really just something to do to pass the time. They wear spirit stones, but their version of the Infinity Circuit is the entire goddamn planet they live on. When they die, they join the world spirit of their maiden world and live on forever in it. The spirit has some limited degree of sentience too. Spoiler alert for a little bit later in the video, but you can piss it off, and it won't be happy with you if you do. In fact, this is a good enough time to discuss what passes for their military. The thing about the Exodite military is that it's not quite as primitive as you might think. They know they live in a dangerous galaxy, so out of all the high-tech stuff they did bring with them, weapons are the most prominent. The Eldar riding the dragons have access to lance weaponry not too dissimilar to what Shining Spears use, and they're of course still vastly potent psychers. Exploding into lightning is just as valid a worry against the Exodites as it is the Craftworlders, potentially more so because the world spirits of Maiden World seem to be a bit more effective at keeping their souls safe than an Infinity Circuit is. And of course, as I said many times by now, dinosaurs. I don't care how much ceramite or whatever fancy fake material you cover yourself in. If Sue decides she's taking a chunk out of you, she's taking a chunk out of you. An individual Exodite or Exodite warband is more than a match for something roughly equivalent from one of the major factions, given their skill, weapons of war, and home field advantage. In fact, the planet itself is one of the greatest assets they have. All they really need to do for 90% of the invaders they might face is clap their hands and wait for the magic to happen, because an Eldar Maiden World can become Katakan on demand. Slightly worse even, because this Katakan is magical and actively hates you for landing on it. Vines will strangle you to death, the wildlife grows bone armor capable of withstanding meltablasts and develop a taste for human flesh, and generally, the Garden of Eden shows that it has some teeth. This is unfortunately one of those times I can only describe as a 40k moment. You know the ones, where someone is described as overwhelmingly powerful and then never actually wins when you look at them fighting. To be as fair as possible to the Exodites, this is likely because the sorts of threats they can successfully fight off are the types that aren't worth seeing being defeated. A stray hive ship lands on a maiden world to replenish, and then all the space wood elves butcher it, or an orc warboss with a bit too much ambition tries to turn it into his personal fortress and gets mauled by velociraptors. Hell, during the Heresy it took 3 Space Marine legions to conquer one single Exodite world, so at least some of these worlds have got some serious firepower. Although unfortunately I might be feeding you bullshit on that one, because the only source I could find for that was the 40k wiki. It wasn't even in an article, it was on a discussion page where some dude said they did that. But Exodite fans are no stranger to Copium, so I'm going to tell you that yes, this random Exodite planet did in fact take on 3 Space Marine legions at their height on somewhat equal footing. No, I don't even have names of the legions to give you, I'm simply going to hope you accept this as truth. The issue comes when the threat increases in scale. Entire Chaos Space Marine warbands, proper Imperial Crusades, even the Tau when they're feeling particularly expansionist and focus on a single maiden world. In these cases, the Exodite's best and only hope is to pray that a craft world has forces nearby available to help them out, otherwise they're doomed. In fact, sometimes they're still doomed. Remember that Eldritch Omens box that came out between the Eldar and Chaos, when they updated the Ranger models and made everyone think we were actually getting a full range refresh? That centered around a Chaos Space Marine warband trying to use the Exodite world for some nonsense or other, while a force from Simhan went to stop them. They succeeded, but all the Exodites were dead by the time they did. When the threats worth looking at knock on the Exodite's door, they have little chance. Not helping this is the scattered nature of Exodite life. While they can and happily will turn the planet into a temporary death world, any Exodite warband is most likely going to be fighting by itself. They're going to fight dirty and make the invaders pay, don't get me wrong. They know their home inside and out, and they're going to act like pointy-eared Katakan soldiers for the duration. But they're Eldar. There's not a lot of them relative to anyone else, and that goes doubly so for the Exodites. A tribe of 1,000 Exodites might get 1,000 to 1 KDR against an invading guardsman army, but that doesn't matter when there's 10 million guardsmen deployed to the fight. And of course, orbital bombardment is a thing. While Exodite worlds are incredibly valuable, plenty of factions are happy to just blow it up. The Orcs don't care about the resources or pristine beauty of the world. Chaos half the time might ruin it on purpose for some ritual or other, and the Imperium might throw cyclonic torpedoes at it for no reason other than spite. In these cases, the best defense the Exodites have is really hoping their enemy doesn't do that kind of thing. They may be superb warriors, but it's very difficult to fistfight a glassing beam. Just ask Noble Team. Speaking of glassing, shout out to Vulcan for seeing a group of Exodites having protected humans from the Dark Eldar. You could ask for no further proof that the Eldar and Xenos in general aren't one big homogeneous blob of bad guys, and his response was the classic one we all know and love the Imperium for. Burning the entire planet to the ground, rescued humans included. Thank you, Vulcan. Thank you for providing all the ammunition any Xenos fan could ever need whenever someone goes, the Imperium is always justified in killing Xenos. Truly, those Eldar bound to a single planet that were only ever seen acting beneficially to the Imperium and just wanted to be left alone were a threat to all of mankind's sacred realm. Back to topic, if you can do what Trazyn did in Infinite and the Divine and more or less rip the heart out of a world spirit, you can also doom the Exodites to a slow death that way, as the planet can no longer keep their souls safe from Slaanesh. They're absolutely going to bring you down with them if you can't cheat like Trazyn does with his body hopping trick, but in the long term, they're screwed. Amongst the various groups of Eldar, they have the best relationship with the Craftworlders. Baal Tan in particular will frequently come to their rescue as they see Maiden Worlds as a critical part of reforging the old empire, but any Craftworld will be happy to help them out if they can spare the troops for it. Rangers in particular will oftentimes spend years on Exodite worlds, using them as a chance to live free from the constraints of the path system. The Exodites are always happy to host them, seeing them as romantic wanderers and sometimes even a source of rare goods and weapons they can't get on their own. The Dark Eldar even despise raiding Exodite worlds for this reason. Aside from the fact that once they realize the Drukhari are present, they're flipping the planet to the murder setting, the Craftworlders will oftentimes have forces skulking about in the webway to act as emergency relief forces for the Exodites. It makes the whole thing not worth the effort required. To end the video, how about I try and imagine what an Exodite army would play like? Obviously the basis for them would be the Wood Elves and the Sylvaneth with some Lizardmen thrown in. I imagine it would be a case of their army being based on what happens when they turn the Catachan switch on. You could have them fighting alongside forest spirits like Dryads, sure, but they canonically ride dinosaurs into battle, so why not have that? In fact, be adventurous with it. Take the Lizardman units and elf them up a bit. Have some dinosaurs be slim and dexterous, like the Ideneth Deepkin riding into battle on eels. They could be covered in moss and branches to mix the wood elf and dinosaur bits together, making them feel like the planet itself really is coming alive to fight you off. Further weaponry, I imagine something like the Sisters of Averlorn for ranged weapons would do nicely. Magical energy bows to fight off the invaders polluting their home. Melee weaponry, of course, could be bow and spears and swords and all that good stuff. That's what they make to use most of their stuff, after all. If you really want to get wild with it, though, this would be the perfect way to bring back Isha. The Wood Elves have Ariel, after all, and this would be a phenomenal way to have the Goddess of Life return to the Eldar through their Maiden Worlds. Show the lesser beings of the galaxy that the powers of love and nature can absolutely kick ass when the time calls for it. And while this might sound a bit crazy, especially since I'm comparing them to Wood Elves, who are very fragile, I think the Exodites could be, on average, the toughest Eldar army. Depending on what units make up their army, this could be done in a lot of different ways. Making tough Dryads or wild animals could be one easy way to make them stronger. The Dragon Knights that ride the dinos could have higher toughness since they're riding a Cretaceous period monster into battle. The lore describes weapons they use on the dinosaurs oftentimes being used to knock them out or daze them, while when they turn them on people it's complete overkill, so giving the monsters higher toughness makes sense. Alternatively, these are Eldar mountain men who do everything by hand and only have their planet to turn to. They live off the land, refuse most forms of high technology, and do all sorts of manual labor the other Eldar factions do their best to avoid in one way or another. The Exodites could be the army of Eldar that reaches the fabled and mythical heights of having toughness 4 be standard for them, representing how they're both physically a bit tougher on average and that they're digging in to defend their one and only home. Skirmishing units would of course be a must, like Catachan, only hopefully with models and rules that don't suck donkey dick. Giving them stealth would be fitting, perhaps if they're close to a terrain feature if you don't want to go overkill with that sort of thing. Their psychic powers could be a great way of enhancing this, maybe marking certain areas as overgrown with wildlife, which gives buffs to nearby Exodite units and debuffs to nearby ones. Sometimes they even put prism weapons on their mounts, so anti-tank weaponry wouldn't be an issue even before we get to them just stomping on you with a big ancient monster. Have you ever wanted a fire prism but in the shape of a Brontosaurus? Because with the Exodites, that's possible. And last but most importantly for their potential tabletop stuff, just give them the Dread Saurian. I'm serious, no changes to it, nothing to make it fit into 40k, just give it to them as is. Also bring it back for the Lizardmen while you're at it. Please, GW, come on. As for their lore, I know critics of giving them an army might say that you'd in universe be bound to just the maiden world they live on. This is fair, but I don't think that's really a good enough reason to not give them an army. The Wood Elves existed, and 90% of them lived in Athel Loren doing their best to never leave it. They still had an army. Plus, some maiden worlds do have webway portals on them. It isn't like you couldn't come up with a reason for them to leave if it was suitably dire or important enough. Maybe a world spirit is failing and an army of them has to travel abroad to find a cure or something like that. Or they're migrating to a new home after the previous one got ransacked by 3 Space Marines and a squad of guardsmen in the latest GW novel. And while this was a bit shorter than most I've put out lately, there's my Exodite video. I don't have anything funny to say. Give them their army, please. You can reuse Lizardman sprues for half of it if you really want to. Just replace the Saurus on top with an elf. Thank you as always to my Warnful channel members. You were the world spirit to my Exodite, keeping me safe from the predations of the beings that seek to devour my soul. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. Did you know an Exodite model won a Golden Demon Award? Did you know it was just what I described towards the end there? A Lizardman mount with an Eldar on top? It hurts so bad. The potential of this army is through the roof, but unfortunately for us all, they're not Primaris lieutenants. I mean, I guess it's fair though, GW's got a lot on their plate. They're far too busy not giving the Leagues of Votann any lore to give the Exodites an army.